Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for our webinar on how to increase engagement with your volunteers using technology with Alex Urquhart and Nick Marchese from Orange Sky Australia. My name is Grant Smith. I'm the Communications and Conference Manager at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand are part of the Info Exchange Group, a not-for-profit social enterprise that tackles the biggest social challenges through the smart and creative use of technology. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So all of our lines are muted, which means if you have any technical issues, please type those into the questions box in your webinar panel and I will be able to assist. Sometimes the best thing to do is just to exit and re-enter the webinar, and that can fix most things. And another thing to note is that if you're having audio and video issues, that can often be because you're overusing your bandwidth, which means if you're in a Wi-Fi connection and you have multiple programs open, please close everything that you don't need and you should have a better experience. Please note that this workshop is being recorded and a link to the recording and the slides will be sent to you after the workshop ends. Before we begin, a little bit about Alex and Nick. So from engineering to the tech world, to the non-profit sector, and finally into volunteering, regardless of the environment he has been in, Alex has been incredibly passionate about innovating and thinking of ways to improve the world around us. As Partner Engagement Manager at Orange Sky and the Volby team, Alex's goal is to understand volunteer management at a deeper level and see how we can help improve the way our sector operates so that we can all improve the way we serve our community. Nick is the 2016 Young Australian of the Year and 2020 Order of Australian medalist. He's an entrepreneur, innovator and storyteller and is also the co-founder and managing director of Orange Sky, which is the world's first free mobile laundry service for people experiencing homelessness. His leadership was recently recognised when he was selected as one of 200 leaders to attend the 2019 Obama Foundation Leaders Program, where he had the amazing opportunity to meet with former President and First Lady Barack and Michelle Obama. And we want to ensure the session is as helpful for you as possible, so please do engage and ask questions. But that is quite enough for me. I will now hand you over to Alex and Nick. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Grant. Fantastic.
Thanks, Grant. What a remarkable. Sorry,
no,
Alex.
You good, Nick?
I was going to say what a remarkable opportunity is to spend the next period of time with you all. And before Alex and I kick off, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands wherever you may be coming from today, and pay our respects to those elders past, present and emerging. And at Orange Sky, we talk about the power of conversation, and conversation's been happening on this land for over 60,000 years, and those conversations will continue today. However, we want to acknowledge the profound contribution that First Nations people have had and continue to look at how as an organisation and how as volunteering involving organisations we continue to strive towards reconciliation. So over to you, Alex.
Great, thanks, Nick. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining in today, and thank you, Grant. That was a very professional introduction. I've never had one like that. So I guess today, to help frame, I guess, the purpose of today's webinar, as Grant said before, we do some help with volunteering organisations, specifically around technology. So we wanted to share with you guys a bit of a journey we've been on the past 12 months around 500 to 600 volunteering organisations that we've met with and interviewed and understood what works, what doesn't work, and then taking a deeper dive into what works at Orange Sky and some lessons learned. And yeah, hopefully everyone can get a couple things out of it. So I'll just move on. The great things of technology. Grant's already done a great introduction. So to kick things off, I always like to unpack a little bit around the whole topic of today. So I'd love to push it over to Nick and particularly around volunteer engagement, and I guess ask you, what does volunteer engagement mean to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a personal experience, I can remember being a teenager growing up in Brisbane and knowing that my school liked giving back to the community. And I could remember one morning my mum sort of coming into my room and telling me to put my school uniform on and where we're going. And I wasn't too sure where we were going. And we ended up volunteering at our school's food van. And I couldn't have been any more uncomfortable. And as a teenager, there was a lot of things that I just didn't want to be there. And I can remember having a conversation that day that changed my life. It was a conversation with a gentleman by the name of Harry, and Harry was just like my uncle or my granddad. He had the same terrible jokes and stories that went on for way too long. But the difference was that Harry was doing it really tough. And I can remember going to school that day and later that night with my family and and thinking about Harry and what decisions he had or hadn't made to put himself in that situation. And as a volunteer at 14 there, what engagement meant to me was that conversation with Harry. And you know, what volunteer engagement means to me now, sort of 6 years on with Orange Sky, we've had over 14,000 people apply to volunteer at Orange Sky. We've now got those 2,000 incredible volunteers through our Volabee platform. And every week we have hundreds or thousands of people that put their lives on hold to go out and help people like Harry. So I think why it's important to engage with volunteers could be as simple as what we talk about at our mission at Orange Sky, which is around the power of a conversation. And whether that be for volunteers, an opportunity for those volunteers who are potentially lonely or isolated, or for volunteers who want to have an active contribution in the community and meet the people that they're out there to help. I think that the engagement is pivotal to that whole ecosystem and critical to things like retention or things like future brand awareness in acquiring more volunteers. And that volunteer life cycle, I'm sure, is something that we're always looking at. I guess some examples of where we've seen volunteer engagement done well. We've tried as an organisation to always learn from the remarkable not-for-profits that are out there in the sector, and by no means is today an opportunity for Alex and I to tell you all how good Orange Sky is. Something we're passionate about is learning from the sector. Something that we did from day one was really try and use technology to engage with our volunteers, and we've done that in good ways, we've done that in bad ways, and we've learned a lot along the process. And I think even yesterday, Alex and I were talking about the journey of engagement and similarities in other emerging sectors. I think that you know, the online e-commerce industry is potentially, in rightly or wrongly ways, some of the best ways of keeping people engaged and connected, and to continually to purchase things. And how can we take potentially something that doesn't take the best behaviors, but to actually take the attributes of that story into what we were doing. And I guess how volunteering engagement affects areas of our organisation, as we all know, is that volunteers are pivotal to operations. So Orange Sky, for instance, could not operate without those thousands of volunteers who put their lives on hold every week to go out and volunteer. However, I think it's more than the economic contribution, as we would all know, or the workforce contribution. It's the value of life that is gained by those everyday interactions that is pivotal. And I think that's something that I'm always fascinated at is when we started off, we were quite specific around the volunteers that we were looking, and we were quite specific about the journey that we were trying to take volunteers on and what engagement meant. But as an organisation that tries to lean into the richness and diverse nature of us as complex humans, that means that our volunteer engagement has had to become more complex. And it's something that we're always looking at is how do we really curate simple engagement and make it sort of as meaningful as possible.
Sure, well done, Nick. That was great on autopilot straight through. And one thing when we like to go off script, I guess for volunteer engagement, what does that sort of look like? Like, is it purely just going on shift and talking to volunteers, or you know, how does volunteer engagement manifest, at least with sort of Orange Sky? Like, is it from go to woe, or is it, how does it exist across different platforms or different areas of Orange Sky?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and something that I think we're still uncovering where our engagement best lies. I think at its simplest form, when someone goes out and actually participates in that activity, is probably where the engagement is as easy as possible, and you know, the operations team can focus on putting mechanisms in place to make sure that you know, that engagement is as fulfilling as possible. And I think it's easy to become sort of complacent in knowing that the volunteering opportunity is so profound that you can become complacent in other areas. And for us, where we really focus on is from the point of application, or even being aware of what Orange Sky does, how can we engage volunteers in that? Something that we learnt in the early days is that we just asked people to apply, and we had thousands of people signing up and wanting to help. And we actually didn't use their help. We never got a large percentage of people out on shift because once they learned a little bit more about Orange Sky, once they learned about the shifts they could participate in, they realized that volunteering wasn't realistic with them at their point of life. And as an organization, I don't think we were doing a great job at engaging people who wanted to put their lives on hold to go and help. So from that awareness and application or applicant state through an expression of interest, all the way through to volunteers exiting, we're fortunate as an organisation that our retention is quite high, and I think that is skewed by the maturity of our organisation. So in the coming years, how can we really lean into volunteers who potentially have volunteered with us for 5 or 10 years and who are wanting a break, and how do we make sure that we engage with those volunteers and make sure that that journey or that pathway to another organisation is as beneficial as possible. So I think it can be as broad as that or as specific as the one activity that they're doing on an operational sense.
Awesome, well said. So before we, I guess for the purpose of this webinar today, we want to really focus on how technology can help volunteer engagement. So as Nick said before, there's so many different areas that volunteer engagement and volunteer management can sort of exist, and how it can benefit the entire organization as well as the lives of the volunteers as well. But something that I've been super excited and fortunate enough the last 12 months, the same before, we've spoken with many volunteering organizations, and we're looking to see how we can improve that. And something that I really strongly believe in is that I don't think it's possible to really solve something or even discuss it or even unpack it unless you first understand it. And in particular, for the sake of this webinar around technology, I think technology is useless unless you understand the process it's meant to fix. Technology doesn't really solve, it doesn't really create anything new, it doesn't invent something, it makes lives easier and faster. So I think after so many sort of hundreds of conversations last year, I began seeing sort of a pattern, and we started to unpack that a little bit more probably in the last 100, and started vetting our problem statement against it and saying, well, what is volunteer engagement, and I guess why is it critical, and what is the problem statement that if we could solve or if we could get better at, it could enrich obviously the organization, the volunteers, and then the community's lives. And I actually had some organizations help me build this problem statement and audit myself. But basically, just to read it out, I need volunteers to help achieve my mission or goal to the community. And although I love and care deeply for my volunteers, it's extremely time consuming and frustrating to manage them. As due to external commitments, 90% of those people can be unreliable and non-committal because a lot of their volunteering duties exist outside of like their third or fourth priority in life. They've got family, they've got work, they've probably got university as well. So they sort of give what they can, which is incredibly valuable. But we make no mistake in understanding that they've got very busy lives, which brings it down to the point of without highly engaged, highly active volunteers, I cannot achieve my mission and thus cannot continue to run my organization. So that was something that really, I think about this way too often than I should. And I think that it's something that collectively, as Nick said, we like to collaborate with other organizations. And if we could figure out a way to really nail this and get it done properly, as well as accommodating for the volunteers and for the organizations, I think we're pretty steadfast to improving this for the sector. To go on the back of that, I'll pull some information throughout the presentation. We'll jump back and forth between Nick and I, but I really want to excited to share some information, some of the surveys and some of the interviews we did with the sector in the last 12 months. And another piece just off the back of that, and I vetted this to a couple of organizations too, just to check our thinking. And I guess looking at that, at the flow diagram on the screen there, we sort of looked at it and went, well, the goal is obviously on the back of that problem statement is highly active, highly engaged volunteers with less time. And one thing that I think every single meeting that I have starts with something along the lines of, I love my volunteers and they're super passionate, but I spend 30, 40 hours a week calling them, texting them, emailing them, which is fine, but it can be sort of draining and then also hard to scale on top of that as well. So I guess what they want to do is split it into volunteer management. And something for today, particularly because the title of this webinar is volunteer engagement, I was really keen to sort of say there's probably a bit of a difference between the two that I started to notice. There's volunteer coordination and volunteer engagement. And some of the key things around that and some lessons learned was there's a big difference, and I think it's sort of an art versus a science versus an art, coordination engagement. There's having people who sign up, complete the expression of interest form, as most organizations typically have, having a way they can go through the system, do an induction, a police check, you know, all the sort of facts and check boxes. And then once they're through, it needs to be coupled with the volunteer engagement. So something that also, as Nick said before, makes people feel valued, gets them on shift, gets them connected with the cause or with the people who are out there. And I guess I probably wouldn't say that either one is more important than the other. I think people have different preferences, but overall, I think two important points of the top feedbacks on the right-hand corner of the screen there would be that coordination can be automated. And I think coordination is something that is it can be repetitive, as I said, expression of interest forms or rostering or things like that. And so I think that's where any sort of automation can sort of come into it. But when it comes to engagement, it can be a little bit more complex. It's sort of, we had a conversation yesterday with our team around how do you measure engagement? And I guess it's kind of like saying, how do you measure a relationship? It's really hard to do so, but there's certain areas you can see and tell from them. Go to the next screen. So I guess from how does Orange Sky manage their volunteers? I'd love to open that up a little bit more, put it back to Nick around some insights around, how does Orange Sky, I guess, source the volunteers or engage with them, or how do they apply, and how do we connect? How do you continue to retain the connection so you can keep going towards your cause?
Yeah, great question, Alex. And I think very similar to the flow that you've looked at is when we started, we knew very little about volunteers and still on that journey of learning a lot. And I think for a long period of time, we focused on that coordination space. So, you know, we went from one van with a couple of volunteers going out on a frequently basis to very quickly hundreds and thousands of volunteers going out. And as an organization, that was in that small category, we didn't really have any expertise or services or software to manage what we were doing. And I can remember launching our second van in Melbourne, and we had a form that we'd built on our website which said, if you want to volunteer, sign up. And I think we collected you know, their first name, last name, email, and some notes like, tell us why you want to volunteer. And overnight we had hundreds of people registering to volunteer, and we realized at that point we had no tool to efficiently or effectively onboard and triage and communicate to our volunteers. And a few weeks later we decided to employ a software developer who worked with us in building out a lot of systems to manage our volunteers. And I think as an organization, looking back at what we've been through, that was one of the pivotal parts to our success. However, now in what we've learned from COVID and what we've learned through maturing as an organization, I think that some of the systems that we actually built were too complex and actually put barriers in place for us bringing volunteers on board. So one example of that is prior to COVID, it would take 100 days from when someone applied on our website through to being out on a shift. And where that became is that we had so many volunteers on wait lists and we had such good volunteer retention that it would be very rare for a volunteering spot to become open and for a volunteer to be pushed through on that shift. So the average is a volunteer every 100 days out on shift. And through COVID and through having to reimagine what our service looked like, we got that average time from when someone applied on our website to being out on shift to 14 days. And as an organization who has been disrupted a lot through COVID, what our biggest barrier to helping people right now is actually volunteers. So last week we started using another piece of technology to actually mean that we could run all of our training online, and actually mean that we've got volunteers this week that within 24 hours of applying on our website are out having their first ever shift. And I think that you know, from expression of interest or through to our targeted ads in letting people know about what the volunteering opportunity is, through to leaving, that ecosystem is really, really important. One of the things that we really lean on heavily is how do we provide a really personal experience to the volunteers. So as a distributed model that operates at 35 locations across Australia and New Zealand, We have no staff members that actually geographically run services. Our role of our operations team is actually to build tools so volunteers can help people directly. So all of our local management is run through volunteers, and how we do that is through really building tools and empowering the volunteers to run their local areas. And we've seen some really great success in that local ownership model. What we do with that though is provide really good engagement, regular touch points through face-to-face or virtual communication. We use some task management and communication management systems. We use our volunteering operations tools to make sure that we can sort of streamline it through there.
Nice, yeah, and that's a good point. Before you were saying you empower the volunteers, and I guess in Orange Sky World, the activity leaders to go out and sort of run those shifts as well. How did you go with doing that, I guess, from the beginning even till now, to empower people? I've had conversations where that idea can be sort of nerve-wracking, that people say they have to let go of power and give it to a volunteer to help manage. How did you find that, sort of giving it to the volunteer leaders or to the volunteers? Was there any sort of bottlenecks or any challenges, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think, there's always complexity, and what we've tried to embrace as an organization is to be resilient to trying and knowing that some things aren't going to work. I can remember the first time we entrusted volunteers to run our service. Lucas and I flew back from Melbourne, and we gave the volunteers the keys, and so said, we'll see you in a few weeks. And they had our phone numbers, and we got back to Brisbane, and we had no idea if the van went out, were the volunteers okay? Did they need anything? Was there any incidents? And I can remember landing in Brisbane and being so terrified that as an organisation that talks about positive connection, we'd done that really poorly. So we said, well, how can we connect all our vans to the internet? And that's what we did, is we built our own app that would step volunteers along the whole process of being a volunteer at Orange Sky, and collect information which we could then visualize back in Brisbane and really use that to engage. So from little things around, had a volunteer been trained, had a volunteer been sent a t-shirt, had a volunteer been checked in after their first shift, all those things were things that we knew were important to engaging our volunteers, but we just had no system to do it. So that's when the evolution of using some technology came in, and I think that's been really critical to our success.
Awesome. Cool. All right. I want to jump back to, as mentioned before, we collect a lot of data and a lot of conversations over the past just over 12 months now. And there's some really interesting key points that I found, and I wanted to highlight a couple because I'm sure I found them really valuable. So hoping everyone sort of listening get something out of this as well. But I think some part of it, as I mentioned before, understanding the process, in my opinion, is probably 90% of the work when trying to improve something. So I guess understanding it, what we found that we asked the questions, how much of your operations are focused on volunteering? And there was mixed sort of reviews, some very low, some very high, but on average, over about 50 or so people, it was about 46%, you can see on the screen there, was focused on volunteering, which I found really interesting because a lot of these organizations were volunteering focused, but then I completely appreciate there's things around fundraising and administration and getting the cause and the mission out there for brand awareness. But then I asked straight after that, I asked the question, how critical are volunteers to your operations? And like all bar very few were sort of said almost 100% critical. They were saying that it's absolutely necessary for us to have highly engaged, highly active volunteers, and without them, we just couldn't do what we did. So I sort of looked at that for a while, and I pondered it for about a month, and I was like, well, what does that mean? And why, if something was so critical, you'd think you'd pour the resources in. But I think it comes down to the fact that things are so critical that we had all the time and resources in the world, would give it to all parts of the organization, but sadly there's even the critical pieces, we need to be able to do more with less. It gets more and more difficult to if everything's critical, we got to split ourselves into two. So which really sort of sparked conversation around improving that process. And I think the easiest way, apart from general innovation and thinking of different ideas and technology, is exactly tech. And I guess I'm pretty close to software, so I favor that a lot. But I guess looking at things around how can you do more with less? Instead of doing 40 phone calls a week, how can we set up something that can collect information or help people with there's some great EDM tools out there that can send reminders and sort of so on. So I think that was a really strong argument to say, well, there is room for tech here. It's just how do we use it properly, and we don't sort of waste time on that area. Part of this as well, we asked a few questions around, you know, what's the amount of time, and there were some varying results, some extreme, some quite low. But I think on average, I averaged all these across, and we sort of looked at it. It was about just under 7.5 hours per week that was spent engaging with volunteers, and that sort of varied a bit. A lot of that had to do with administration, but some was people having to cover shifts, or some calling on the phone, or you know, celebrating people's birthdays. But what we found, that you can see on the left, there was probably 90% of those were through phone calls, 80% through emails, 50% were through other sort of text-based applications. And something that sort of screamed out to me in all those three is that majority of those are very manual. And I sort of looked at that and went, well, you've got one full day of work is almost 7.5 hours of a full-time job. And most organizations we speak to, particularly in that smaller zone, they're usually part-time workers. They're so amazing, and I have a lot of respect for them. They're so passionate that they sometimes work a full-time job, plus they've got kids, plus some have uni, and they still find time to sort of do this. So I thought, if this is a lot of it's manual, then tech has to play a part. What that looks like could vary from place to place, but I guess it needs to be a way to make things more efficient. And my goal would be, or my dream would see to people that they could run their own mission or do their own, you know, special impact to the community without needing to take out a second job. And so part of this, when we heard some sort of qualitative feedback, these were some of the answers. I'm not the best animator, so that's sort of what's a representation of the size of the responses that we got, to sort of summarize that. But most people, when we asked them regarding your volunteer engagement, you know, what would you want to spend less time on? And by far, administration was the biggest, which sort of coupled with a bit of rostering. Recruitment, I think, is always sort of a common one, and I think that's always sort of looking at the pipeline flow of meeting new volunteers and getting them to join, and then having them right down the bottom of the pipeline, becoming a bit of an advocate, or becoming someone who is always there on shift and recommends people to come and join. And then another very common one that for some reason last probably 2 or 3 months I'm hearing more and more is trying to find replacements for shifts not covered, or for activities not covered. Sort of people who, as I said, quite busy with their day-to-day lives and need to find maybe at last minute's notice, can't make it and have to sort of pull out, and then other people have to fill in, or sadly sometimes we have to postpone some of those activities. Another piece around this was if you could spend less time on these aspects, and if you could try and reduce these, I'm really interested to see what would that mean. So if you look at that, as I said before, if we can use certain ways to improve that process, it sort of goes from the problem to the process, then to the solution. And I was really curious that, I mean, myself and Nick would have thoughts around what would that mean if we could do things better, faster, stronger. But I was really curious to ask the people, you know, what would they want to do more? And by far the biggest one was more time on their cause. And I've worked previously for software and tech organizations in the past, and I guess for the for-profit world, it always goes back to the bottom line. People want to be more efficient, more innovative, and that means you know, more for their shareholders, more growth, more excitement. But obviously in the non-profit world, for a lot of us volunteering organizations, it's really focused on different output. There still is an output. It's just it varies, and what that could be. It could be intrinsic, just wanting to do their sort of activities, but a lot of the time is these great organizations who want to feed, or they want to help clothe, or they want to house people, and they sort of said, we would want to have less admin. It means I could open up 3 or 4 more activities, or perhaps I could spend more time engaging with the people in need, which is the whole reason they started in the first place. Some of them occurred around growth, not all the time, but it was a pretty common one. People were saying, you know, I have a goal for 2022, the end of 2022, I want to open, there's one of our partners that we work with, and they do, they help with animal rescue places, and they said they've got 3 or 4 locations now, and their goal was to get to about 8 or 10, I think, from memory. And they said that's like their shining goal. So obviously not money, but if they can improve this process, make it faster, more efficient, how could they? What would be that goal at the end of the tunnel? There was some other pieces around like nice parts of volunteering, like engagement, support, and recognition. So again, that sort of goes back to that tighter bond to their volunteers. And another really important was around writing grants, which I know that can take a lot of time, and people are saying if they could get more involved with that, get more funding potentially, they could look to, which probably feeds into things like growth and spending more time on their cause. So now sort of going from volunteer engagement on the sort of wider scale right down to like technology, pretty keen to open this up and think about volunteer engaging with technology. I know sometimes it can be a bit of a taboo subject. I know there's some people say, you know, I've got 5 volunteers that I think of them like family, and so the idea of putting them on a technology platform seems so robotic and disingenuous. But I guess there are always cautions, there are positives and negatives to this. And I guess I'll probably switch this back to Nick. And I said, probably in your experience, I guess with Orange Sky, but in general, across the sector and in your 6 or 7 years now in the not-for-profit world, like what would you say the biggest advantages are with technology with volunteers?
Yeah, I think at an even broader scale, like technology is fundamental to the world we live in right now. And I think really leaning into that and not being afraid of a personal observation that I made through not being from this sector and being passionate about using tools is that a lot of the time as a sector, I think we use excuses like, you know, we can't afford technology, we can't use technology. And I think it can be summed up in, you know, a lot of organizations like ours having hardware and infrastructure that other corporates had finished using and run to the end of their life 5 years prior, and then the not-for-profit picks it up. And I think what we really need to do as a sector is move towards leading the way and embracing new technology to help people. And I think that you know, there's a lot of really great examples of where that's come from. Again, from a personal story, I can remember I was sharing before that idea of connecting all our vans to the internet and building an app. And gosh, we got it wrong. Lucas and I spent all weekend wiring our washing machines up to the internet. And, you know, from this app that we built, you could press a button and the washing machine would start. And our thinking there was that we would get people to put the name of the load of washing in. And before they put the name in, well, they had to put the name in before they could start the washing machine. And we then had people hiding these tablets around the corner of the place we were operating because they were sure that the tablets were making the washing machines slow down. And, you know, the tablets would drop out of Wi-Fi network, and volunteers would have a machine starting at different times. And it was an absolute disaster and a wrong way to roll it out. And what we realized was that the critical bits of information or the bits of support that we were trying to provide actually could be done in much simpler systems. And I think the advantages of of embracing that technology means that you can provide a more reliable service, you can connect with people more impactfully, and you can scale better in what you can do. And I think that those really simple recurring tasks that have a high impact on a volunteer and can be really automated through low effort systems. We've seen some really great responses with the idea of checking in with volunteers if they haven't volunteered for a while. Like I said, it's very easy to become complacent, I believe, in volunteer engagement for, you know, those 2 remarkable volunteers in that photo there. They're engaged. They don't need to be sent an email. They don't need to be sent a little message or anything like that because they're engaged out on shift. But what about the thousands of volunteers that haven't been out on shift or are waiting for their next shift? How can we give them the experience, whether that be through sharing data of the shift that's just happened, or you know, thanking them for their contribution and asking them if they're willing to join another shift, or just asking them why they're not volunteering at the moment. So I think that's what the advantages are with that. And I guess the disadvantages with any tool is that you know, they can be overcomplicated or they can be not fit for purpose. And I think Alex, I really admire how you started today and how you start all of our calls with the sector and working with Volabee is, you know, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And we've used technology at Orange Sky that we thought was going to solve our problem, and we realized that it wasn't. And I think that's, you know, putting that time into really understanding the problem is a big part of solutions there. And I think as well, one of the disadvantages is being scared of it. And I think that, yes, volunteers are come from diverse backgrounds. Yes, volunteers potentially aren't used to seeing technology in these sectors, but I think we also need to realize that technology wears or shows up in so many different ways in our lives. And I definitely don't think it's an age thing. I definitely don't think it's a geographic thing. Like, absolutely, there are limitations and technical literacy that some people don't have the luxury of. However, I think that there's some really light touch ways that can be encouraged. And one of those examples is that when we rolled out the second version of our app, we had a lot of pushback from volunteers saying, hey, we've never had this tablet before. Why do we need it? You know, I just come to Orange Sky to wash some clothes. I don't come to, you know, use this scary tablet. And then what we realized is that the volunteers weren't seeing the value of the data and the tools that we were seeing back in Brisbane. You know, the idea of what was the level of the water tank, how many loads of washing did we do, how many times has that volunteer been out on shift, what's the safety rating of that shift. And what we realized is that we had access to all this data that we were getting so much value from, but they just weren't seeing it. They were putting all the hard work in to capture it, and they weren't seeing it. So then sending the volunteers a copy of the report they just submitted, or checking in with a volunteer after an incident, something that we started to see is hundreds of incidents being reported on a monthly basis, and that was really important to our incident management culture. But then we didn't have good tools to follow up, and people would say, hey, you know, I just reported this incident and no one called me or no one checked up with me. So using things like SMS to check in with the volunteers straight away, automating our calls so we make sure that for any severe incident, a volunteer is called and checked in on and taken on a journey to be supported. And that's when people start to realize the value of putting a report in, as if, you know, there was a leaky tap in a van and they saw that their report actually meant that the van could go out the next day and help people. That's when we start to see that mutual benefit. And I touched on it before, but those common challenges, I think, are being afraid or saying, you know, we don't have enough time or money, or our community isn't prone to using technology. I think that you know, the amazing work that Info Exchange does in their digital literacy reporting and research just proves that. And I think that you know, there are some great things that came out of COVID, and I think one of them is the extraordinary step forward in technological advancement within our sector. And I think keeping that momentum is really important. And you know, I think that the idea of using technology to make an organization more efficient can be as simple as reducing overhead to make sure that you can onboard more volunteers. But I think it's also more than that. You know, something that I'm passionate about and always need to remind ourselves is that the efficiency isn't to make my job easier or to make our team more reliable. It's actually to help more people. And I think that that's at the core of this, is that if we can use any tool, whether that be technology, whether that be culture, whether it be you know, your brand, if you can use that in a positive way to help more people, I think that's where the magic happens. And I think that, you know, we know every day now that if we get more volunteers and we connect them with more opportunities, more people's lives are changed. And I think that's where we always frame it, is that if we can build a dashboard to look at pockets of when our assets aren't being utilized, or if we can see volunteers that are potentially dropping off in their reliability, can we check in with them and see if they're okay, or check in with their ideas? That's sort of where we're really seeing an effective use of technology in helping more people and being more impactful.
For sure. And I think you touched on there a little bit as well, and something again I'm really passionate on looking at focusing on the process and the challenge. And I think those 2 points there in the middle on that screen, the expectation of technology, and then people who don't focus on the challenge first. And I've definitely been guilty of that. And I think, looking at patterns in nature, I think there's a lot of the world that can learn things from volunteer management. I think there's a lot of things in the world and processes that volunteer management can sort of learn from. And I think one of the ones that that first point around, and I think it's really good to highlight, is I sort of look at it like looking at technology. Some people can go shopping on an empty stomach and buy things they don't need and do things, and it's sort of one end of this of the scale of they bought 10 different pieces, and I sort of look at it like it's like a builder buying more tools. It doesn't make him a good builder, but it can, if he uses the right ones at the right time, it can make it much easier. So understanding, I guess, what people need and not falling for, I guess, buzzwords and things that sound great, but looking at your process first and saying, well, you know, I think Nick, you touched on a few good ones there around perhaps just feedback, reminders, perhaps coordination, or even communication pieces, and not just buying all the bells and whistles. And then also the expectations of tech on the other end of the scale. You know, in the past, and I guess myself too, I think the old philosophy of technology is that people like to buy one thing and want it to work for everything. And a really common technology is Salesforce, and it's a fantastic platform, and it solves multiple problems. But I guess I've seen people try to take one piece of technology and try to stretch it across 50 different areas. And then they start doing workarounds, and they end up spending more time on their job than they were without it. So I think looking at the expectations and seeing it, as I said before, try to relate it back to being a tool, and try to see tools as there's different tools that work good for different jobs. You know, if going back to the builder analogy, if he had one hammer and thought he could do everything with that one hammer, he'd be in a strife. So making sure that whatever you want to do with it, you've got the right pieces at the right time. And then this one here, fortunately we actually unpacked this a lot yesterday, so it's right on the top of my mind. But you know, I'll be cautious of time here because I could go for about 2 hours on this. But this is something that I think is so important when it comes to, and I probably look at I spoke a bit earlier about the art versus the science, and I think when you look at the science side of things, you know, having Nick touched on before around a great culture and making sure you connect with people and make them feel valued and I guess part of the mission. That's key. I don't think you can do. I don't think that can ever be replaced. But then you look at certain things. I think when it comes to, one thing I noticed a lot was with all the organizations we spoke to, it's a bit of a funnel in what we found around sourcing volunteers. So how technology could look in there when sourcing volunteers is that I think there comes a bit of a stage gate levels from people who you might get, I think on average, and this is me sort of being pretty lenient, I think if we took what it were to take 100 volunteers and then take them from expression of interest to maybe an online application, to maybe an interview, for maybe doing their background checks, police checks and so forth, anything that's sort of needed in that area, all the way until when they become on shift or they start being active in your organization, and all the way down to them being there for a year. And ideally, the end goal is to have super excited, passionate people that are there forever. You know, I'd say probably less than 5%. So from that 100, we'll probably go down to about 5 in the end. I've said 10 on the side of the screen there. But I think what's really important, and where technology can help a lot, particularly just understanding it, but then refining it, is understanding what your, I guess your funnel is for volunteering, and how many people are applying, and then not being afraid to really break down and being super honest. And I've done this with a couple of organizations, and go, okay, so when they apply for an expression of interest, what does that look like? How hard is that? Are there people leaving here? Is it too complicated? Is it confusing? Can you see the right button you got to click on? All the way down to, you know, Nick said before, maybe you can do online inductions from that 100 days was 14, now hopefully 24 hours. Is there areas that we can tweak? And I think looking at it like a funnel, if you can try and spread it out and make it really smooth, really easy, and I think really enjoyable, something around that engagement. Perhaps speaking to the operations manager here, he was saying, Mike Duggan was sort of talking about maybe sending videos when someone applies, you know, getting that excitement and saying, hey, this is what you'll be doing on shift, or this is what we did last night, and we're really excited to have you part of the journey. So I think looking at that process and really breaking it down for sourcing volunteers and understanding your pipeline across those, and those, what's there, 6 different points there. Those are probably the main ones that I see the most. But again, these could be 3 steps, these could be 30, but something to understand that when you start that process, it's going to be a small touch. And then as they go through it, they're going to have higher expectations and more commitment to the organization. So, oh, I'm getting a flashing light. Nick, can you still hear me?
I can still hear you there, Alex.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, the thing was flashing at me. And so I think when it comes to the actual pipeline of how it works, and then seeing that and using technology in those areas. So looking at the top of the pipeline, there's things around, Nick said before, around Facebook ads. something that purely just shows awareness that can be done quite cost effectively, and just sort of explaining your mission. And as I've heard a lot of the times that the best way to source volunteers is align people with your mission. Most of the missions that we hear from organizations, they're ones that you can't help but be excited about. And if you can talk about that and get someone's interest, maybe fill the top of the funnel and get them to those next couple of steps to being part of your journey. Things around landing pages, I've had in my past doing some volunteer work. There have been some really confusing ones that I've been a part of. And I think at the start, when it's sort of a little bit of interest, if it becomes too complicated, people just leave. So that's something that I think I'd urge everyone to maybe audit themselves and have a bit of a think of, put yourself in the volunteer shoes. How easy is it to find you guys? How easy is it to apply to become part of the sort of mission? And I think volunteers are incredibly lovely and amazing people that are willing to give their time, but not being taken that for granted, and try to make it as simple as them to move through. Maybe changing that 5% conversion to 10%, and then you extrapolate that over time, and you could have potentially 100 of very strongly committed volunteers within a couple of months. Their digital presence as well, making sure things like Seek Volunteering, Go Volunteer, and then maybe even a referral system. I've heard this a lot, and I've heard a lot of people say, you know, using that graph before of say 100 people apply, right down to those 5 people who are, you know, super passionate and huge advocates. Maybe we can have a referral system on them, because if they're so passionate about it, surely, you know, birds of a feather, they sort of hang out with people with similar beliefs and similar ideologies and thoughts. Perhaps they know 3 or 4 other people that would love to be a part of it as well. So not being afraid to ask volunteers and say, hey, is there anyone else in your network that you'd love to bring down, or shoot them a quick link to say, here, put their email address in here if you'd like to offer them an application to come down. And then I guess that's the main 2 areas I sort of see, was that sourcing of volunteers, and then actually working with them, the operation, the management side of things as well. And this one, again, I won't go into too much depth, but I think one of our developers here he calls it the golden circle, and it's really around when it comes to managing and working with volunteers. It's sort of ideally you want to get them in this awesome merry-go-round that they get into the system, they get active, they get involved, and they once they complete the activities or they become part of your work, we appreciate them, we say how much we enjoy working with them, and then we stay connected. And the ideal is, if we can do that properly, they should circle back and then start applying or putting their name down for more activities. And then the more times we go around that loop, the more, I guess, the relationship is built, the more committed they get. So if we can try and tighten that up and break that down into different areas, and sort of looking at things around activate and involve the volunteers. So thinking on the technology side, not straying too far away from the purpose of this webinar, but looking at things around getting volunteers involved on shift. So the idea of, if a volunteer has 10 minutes a month to give you their attention, how can you use that 10 minutes to quickly get them to sort of roster? You know, try to make it not that they need to call up for half an hour to make sure they get on a shift, because they might get too busy and might not have time. So how within 5 minutes they can log on or call or pop in and quickly roster up. And I think there's a peak of excitement, which again, I'm cautious of time, I won't talk too much about this, but there's a peak of excitement that when someone sees like your mission or sees a video, they get really excited and they get motivated to do something. And that peak of excitement over time can then dissipate. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you've been to the show, or if you've been to a conference and then you see something, you get really excited about it, and then 2 weeks time they send you a follow-up email and they said, hey, do you still want to do this? And you go, actually, no, I'm good, I'm back to reality now, I don't have time for this. So I think not about coercing people, but it's about reminding them of why they did get excited, and saying, well, if you're still that excited, come down and join in and participate. All the way down to showing them how much they mean to you. So Nick spoke a little bit around using data of how many hours they do, but even quantifying that. I think one thing Orange Sky does well, and I know Nick likes giving me shout outs on live feeds, but if we look at saying, you know, how many conversations have they had, how many loads of washing, or how many showers is what Orange Sky uses that data and feeds it back to the volunteers to say, you know, this is how much you've contributed. And I've seen a lot of people get excited by that and say, well, my time isn't just an hour, I'm actually contributing X to the community, and because of that, I want to do more. And then finally, staying front of mind. That's probably a really key part about staying connected and making sure that loop keeps going around. And I think that is sort of what I mentioned before, of capitalizing on that peak of interest and getting them excited, and perhaps maybe asking if they'd like to sign up to the next activity while they're during that first one. but keeping up to date with certain things of, here last month we completed, 2,000 hot meals for sort of those in need. If you'd like to contribute for our 3,000th, please sign up next week. It'll take 20 minutes and we look forward to seeing you soon, or something that really excites them to sort of move through. Go to the next one. So another piece, one of the other, and I've got this thing blocking my screen. I'll just push this down. So one of the other questions we asked back to the organizations was, what have you found your volunteers respond really well and engage with really well? And I think engaging with people to understand the impact of their outcomes, which is what we sort of just spoke about then, of it's not just them coming down for an hour and then feeling good that they did something, they went for a walk that morning, so they feel good about themselves. It's about sort of showing them you want to improve and you want to know that you're making a difference, and showing them what the difference is that they're making. And I think each organization is totally different. There's things around qualitatively, maybe some feedback from the person in need. Maybe it's, as I said before, you've helped with 12 loads of washing this week. Thank you so much for your time. Or it could be anything of that nature. I know another one is quality engagement time, which for the sake of technology can be difficult, but I think with quality engagement, I think nothing ever beats a one-to-one conversation or having a coffee with someone. But I think once you get into the realm of 30, 40, 50, 100, 200 volunteers, that can almost seem impossible. So things around how can we make that a bit more tailored to them, maybe taking their feedback on board and sending them personalized emails back, or letting them know their voice has been heard, I think is really important. Another really important one, I guess I'll cover a couple ones in this, is upskilling the volunteers as well. So a really awesome story I heard, I spoke about it yesterday as well, was around an organization that helped with medical professionals, that they will write a paper or they'll do a speech and they'll spread awareness about a certain topic. And when they volunteer for this organization to do that, they grant them a title, and they'll say, part of organization X, you are a ambassador for X. And they award that, and then they endorse them on their LinkedIn profile, and they said it's okay for them to have a certificate on like their CV. And they were saying that there was a lot of medical professionals who are up and coming, and building their resume and their repertoire means everything. And so they said it'd be awesome to show these people and say, here's you are, if you're applying for this new job, this carries a lot of weight. And I think the effect was that each person that joined, there was 2 or 3 other of their people in their network of those professionals recommended them come apply. And they have people lining up out the door who sort of want to jump in and volunteer because they have a really good way of that value exchange. They give you your time and you give them something back of equal value. Screen's blocked there again. And the other question we asked them as well was, what are some amazing ideas regarding volunteer engagement that we can learn from? I spoke a bit about that one just before. I think another one is, there was another really great one I heard from a museum in Melbourne, and they were saying that a lot of the volunteers were really passionate about helping people, but they were even about the information behind it. And it was a museum about a certain culture, and they were so keen on that culture, and they wanted to learn more, and they wanted to learn how they could be a better volunteer at this museum. And so they did a bit of a road trip, or they did a bit of a like an expedition around to a bunch of different other museums, and they educated themselves and sort of showed what other people were doing well, what they weren't doing well. And they said that was the best response I've ever had from their volunteering cohort. And they had probably 10 to 20 new applicants after that from their friends recommending them. And they said they're really looking forward to the next one, and can we do one next month as well? So I think that idea of volunteer engagement, you can definitely make ways through technology, but not forgetting that aligning to the volunteers and the reason why they're there is so critically important. One thing I will touch on too around that idea of Nick spoke before, and I think empowering your volunteers to carry out your mission and having the confidence and maybe the systems behind it to facilitate that. And something, again, I'll give another shout out to Orange Sky. I think Nick and Lucas have done a really good job, and something I admired before I sort of came here was that the culture that they imbue from the top right down to the bottom is people out on shift. They've got such the culture is the same everywhere you go. Everyone's friends, everyone's looking out for each other, everyone's having fun. And I think a really good culture and fostering connections between volunteers is super important as well. Giving them the platforms, I know there's WhatsApp groups and things like that, but when people feel like more of a family, I guess it encourages them more to get back out on shift and do more and get more excited about the cause in the first place. Now, I'm just cautious of time, so I'll go these ones as well. We'll send this presentation through afterwards. But I think one other last question that's really worth noting here as well is, what would it mean to have the right tech and the right improved volunteering process? And it's a really interesting question that we heard back from a couple of surveys. And I think a lot of people turned back and said that it would mean they had more continuity. And I know a really common one was they felt like a pillar where everything rested upon them. And they sort of went, well, if I leave or if I'm not here next week or if I go on holidays, I'm terrified that everything will fall apart. So they thought if I had the right volunteering process, the right system in technology in this case, it would be fantastic that I could leave and I would feel comfortable that all the information would be there. Everyone could roster themselves on. Everyone would feel comfortable and empowered to do what they need to do. And I think another one is I'd have more time to engage with the volunteers. So a lot of people saying that, again, going back to that point, they want to be involved in the reason they started the organization or the reason they joined the organization instead of following up on sort of administration work. Another one was all around all the information in one place for the annual report. I've heard that pretty common one I hear a lot is they've got probably across 12 different spreadsheets and 12 different Microsoft Office platform PowerPoint presentations of what they've done throughout the year, and trying to pull that into a board report or into a presentation can sort of be a bit of a nightmare. So it all sort of ties back to themselves around less stress and more time for strategic work, more time for growth. And I guess more personal fulfillment is a really strong key pointer on that as well. People who start working for nonprofits, they're amazing. They have amazing dreams, and they have their values are aligned to why they want to be there, and they want to fulfill that as well. They want to be there to either help clothe people or help support people in sort of any way they can. And just to sort of wrap things up, the last couple of points here was what is some advice with tech and volunteering? Nick, you said some really good ones before around not being afraid of change. I guess what would be, for someone who knocked on your door today and said, I'm thinking about doing this, what would be your advice to them?
I think, Alex, you just gave us heaps of ideas and thoughts there. I think, just giving it a go. And I think that that's something that we've all had to be potentially forced into in the last 12 months. And I think that keeping that momentum of just trying to continually iterate those tools and systems, and like any tool, using your hammer analogy, tools need to be maintained, they need to be upgraded, and they need to be refined. And the tool is only as good as the operators that are using it. So I think there's never going to be one solution out there. And even today, our team, we thought we'd found a perfect solution for managing our knowledge base, and then didn't realize the integrations we need to provide through different countries and different policy views. So in the coming months, we'll have to review our document management and our knowledge base management, and that's something that takes time. It takes donors' money. It takes potentially a distraction from helping those end users. But if you can find really good ways to test things and give things a go and iterate on it, is potentially where it's going to become less challenging and frustrating. So I think what organizations can start doing today is really leaning into those tools. And I really encourage that, is that we went from an organization where we tried to build every tool for ourselves, and we got to a point where we built a lot of things that we actually realized people were building much better way better out there in the sector. So things around using tools that you admire in your everyday life to communicate or to connect or to manage tasks, using them for volunteer engagement is really great. We use Asana across our organization for our task management, and we use a lot of automated task generation from our volunteer platform and from Volabee to engage into volunteers. So whether that be a reminder to check in with a volunteer a week after their first shift, or a reminder to prep for a webinar, those task automation tools are incredibly helpful. And then really trying to use tools that help scale and amplify consistent messaging. So we use a lot of tools around giving our volunteers templates for how they can communicate with their team, and those ones are really helpful. And on your point around, can tech ever trump personal engagement, I think that's a really tough question to answer. And I think how I'm feeling currently at the moment is I think that technology can actually trump personal engagement, but not on the direct connection, but on the ability to be able to scale it and remind it. So just like we've all got friends and family that we should reach out to and we forget to because of the busyness of the hustle and bustle of life, it's just like volunteers, is that there's to effectively scale and grow, there's never going to be a way that you can manage those one-on-one relationships, I think, without using a tool, but there's a really nice balance between both of them.
And I think I'm just cautious of time as well too, Grant, but I think there's one last piece I want to just quickly touch on, and mainly because it took me a while to make that image, but I'd love to hear, Nick, your last couple of thoughts around, I think a pretty common conversation is, what's going to happen in 2021? And I guess looking at how does technology fit into this? And then on top of that, I know a lot of conversations we're having at the moment around people saying they've had to hibernate for the past couple of months through COVID, but they're looking to kick things off now. They want to start bringing volunteers on, starting shifts. I guess what would be your thoughts or your recommendations for 2021 around people who are waking up sort of after this hibernation and wanting to get started quickly?
Yeah, I think it's that there's a lot of work coming, and whatever industry we're in, we know that the demand for volunteering is changing, the way that people work is changing, and the demand for these services is absolutely increasing. So my biggest advice for 2021 would be to really lean into those tools that are going to help you switch back on. And if that's specifically, for Orange Sky, we've gone from having to onboard 2,000 volunteers in less than a month. We couldn't do that without technologies. And I think the other thing is that I think the biggest change in technology at the moment is integration. So, making your tools connect with other tools, is that there is no one tool to do it all. And that's something that we're really leaning into as an organization, is how do we connect multiple tools across the ecosystems that we're working across to be constantly in sync. And that's a big challenge.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, mate. And apologies, I think I spoke too long, but I think we're almost out of time. Grant, do you want to switch back to yourself, or was there any other questions or anything we can sort of wrap this up with?
No questions at the moment, Alex and Nick. That was a really comprehensive presentation. Really, really good to hear what you guys have been up to, and really sort of sets the bar for everyone else. So thank you so much for that. Look, that is everything from today's presentation, everyone. One final thank you to Alex and to Nick for joining us and providing all that great advice and information. And thank you to everybody who tuned in and watched. Please do complete the questionnaire at the end of the webinar so that we can continue to improve. And aside from that, I'd like to wish everyone a safe and enjoyable day. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.